if I'm an agency leader or owner listening to this, I guess how would you sum up the takeaways of how they should be thinking about AI and data, and then, what they should be considering to do to improve, their position in the market?
Yeah, I think the first thing would be just appoint somebody to focus on it, and then start to think about how are we going to measure impact in the business, right? So start coming up with a plan. We're happy to help. This is part of our process to do that. And then how you want to measure success, and just start somewhere, start any sort of process to get familiar and comfortable with it, and don't be afraid to embrace it. And if something goes wrong, just move on, right? It's it shouldn't be embarrassing or anything like that. Just tried automations that didn't work. Great. How do we correct it? Or we tried to use this chatbot to do to engage, and it wasn't quite right. It's going to happen. You just got to fine tune and work through it, and think about it a little bit more like being an entrepreneur and iterating through your AI data strategy and how it's going to help you grow long term.
Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Looking at your website just before the call, eliminate Buhrmann candidate data quality problems, save recruiter time, and improve performance of search, match, automation, and AI agents. I think this episode will be incredibly valuable for a lot of listeners in terms of understanding all of that. So before we get into the meat, we'd love to hear what inspired you to kind of bring Vetted to life and candidate IQ.
Yeah, happy to dive into that. And you had a long list, right, of different items that we're touching on that website, and I think that's what gets us really excited. Is in this day and age, everything is built off your data, and although we store data in systems, it's really how we manage and how we organize that information is really going to drive output moving forward. So, part of our background and when we founded Vetted was really very aggressive in terms of search and match and AI and innovation. And just on that journey, every time we'd see success or come out with a new invention, it was, well, if the data is bad, right, that algorithm, the output is never going to perform to expectations. So, part of our journey was just discovering that the hard way of how important data is, especially for staffing firms that really want to maximize, right, what they can get from all that hard-earned investment that they put into that database and building that out. And so, yeah, naturally it just sort of evolved, and here we are helping fix data and turn their data into placements.
Amazing. And looking at LinkedIn, Vetted's founded 2014. A lot of us probably have become much more familiar with AI, with ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and all the rest in the last 2 or 3 years. So what was data and AI back in 2014, and how has that evolved, and what have you seen as what's distilled for you in your mind and your strategy going forward from that?
Yeah. So I think, the cool thing is some of the things that we've patented and invented back in 2014 are now actually relevant. So part of the hard lesson, anyone is an entrepreneur, just market timing is really important. And then, don't get too far ahead. You want to be just at that cusp, right, of everything that is emerging. Um, but yeah, so for our sort of journey on AI was really, as we started to build these services and systems, the human element was actually really important to think about. So how does a person trust the models? How do they trust the algorithm? How do they trust the matching systems? So that is, even today, I think, on search and match, if there's things that aren't quite right, or even if your AI model, your AI agent isn't quite right to the opinion of the person who's using it, that's where we started to break down sort of why are we running into these sort of hesitations or trust. And a lot of it even was rooted in data. So we just picked that, hey, everything that we've learned over the 10 years that we've been doing this and building these advanced systems was, there is a piece to this that is always going to be centered around data quality. So if we can eliminate that, then everything is going to be much easier to fine tune or explain or rule out certain reasons why a model might not be performing to the expectations of that user.
I think that hits on a really important point in terms of that sort of candidate evaluation process where, I'm sure a lot of recruiters much more experienced than I am know when they see a CV, they can read between the lines. When they have that interview, they
Yep.
can notice that really small nuance of body language, and they get signals, and so I think a lot of tools certainly that I've heard or seen of maybe haven't had that same level of um, insight, and so I think it's how are you seeing the balance of taking data and AI to help, but also enhancing that recruitment process?
Yeah. Just want to touch on something. So that was one of our first products that we'd integrated actually to eRecruit and Salesforce was a personally trained model because you talked about the nuances. So experts, right? They can pick up on oddities, right, in a resume or just say, hey, these are the things I value out of that resume. And then only use that information, right, to make an assessment. So I think that's things that we're going to start running into, right, is around context and relevancy from right the staffing firm and what they care about and things that they've learned. I think that's going to be a lot harder now that everyone's using ChatGPT to create their resumes and write it in a certain way, right? And say, hey, look at this job description, write my resume to meet, to meet all everything in there so I can get qualified. Um, but you also do have an issue around job descriptions not being written very well. So, anyways, there's a whole world, right, of sort of qualifying, evaluating information on both job descriptions, the resumes, using that data, right? So you sort of have layers of analysis, and then once you process that, okay, what's the remaining information going to be used to make a match or recommendation? But I think the ability now to scale out, I think, people and just make them more efficient using these new tools is pretty amazing. Even the personalized marketing, messaging, all of that helps with that engagement. So it's they're just seeing the adoption and people willing to embrace these new technologies and these new services. I think both from the recruiter side, the technology side, as well as the candidates are getting used to it. So it's not like, "Hey, this bot reached out to me, I'm angry." It's, "Oh, okay, like, this is sort of par for the course, and I'm gonna have a more efficient way to process and evaluate my opportunities with this firm."
And with hiring, in a traditional sense, comes biases, and I think some people I've spoken to, they also question, could the AI also be biased depending on what how it's been trained, what information it's been given? How is that kind of playing out at the moment?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting one, and why and again, I think we got way too ahead of ourselves, but why we went the route of doing personally developed AI agents is then you can measure bias, right? So you could have 2 people develop a model, although, training that model was more arduous and that people just don't wanna do that, but you could compare it, right? How would this person rank and judge these candidates? How this other person so actually, one of our goals early on was, hey, you could have, a suite of 10 models running, looking at the same data, and you could actually compare, right, those results and outputs. With the AI agents today, right, or ChatGPT or anything that's going to be evaluating it, it's sort of even though it might have bias in it, it's going to be the same for everybody. So I do think you're going to see some branching of sort of AI models, hey, I want to, fine tune it, but you do have good bias, right? So if you are somebody who says, I know the type of people that excel in this role, that is good bias. You want to make sure that they're not saying, hey, they went to this university or that, and I hate those, I don't like those alumni, so we're not going to hire them.
Yeah.
Um, so there are some tools, there are techniques, but I think it's really overcoming the bias issue is your approach and controls around what data is being fed, what, what types of information the model is going to be making decisions on, and then just comparing the outputs and making sure that there's nothing off. And if there is, then, is it updating a prompt, right, for what it should look for? Is it better controls early on, or you can always silo, run a model on separate independent, groups of applicants to then see those results and sort of give people a fair shot on being qualified.
if we just to take a step back again, thinking about if I'm an agency owner, I've got 100,000, 300,000 records in my database. I get AI can be very helpful for my agency, effectiveness, productivity, success rates. But I do admit that my data is a bit of a mess, right?
Yeah.
Like, where do I start? What are the steps I need to go through to get to a good place?
Yeah, I think it starts with what value are you going to get from it, right? As a business, so everything needs to be tied to the strategies and goals of the business. So, I'd say with sort of increased prices and sourcing tools, right, and external, even LinkedIn, Indeed, all of this, prices have gone up quite a bit. And so, it might be that, hey, we're trying to reduce our reliance and dependence. Others are trying to be more efficient with their team and use and adopt AI. So if that's the case, you got to have your data in your database. But how we approach it is really more of a, you know, advisory in terms of let's look at your data. Like we have developed systems that can go in, scan, and analyze, a set of records. We can have a conversation. Hey, what are we seeing, right? What are those opportunities? How would that align with your goals? So it's really helping them sort of structure those hot buttons, both
Mm.
for the overall business, right? Those goals, the recruiters, what are they frustrated with? Maybe what's holding the business back in terms of, starting with sourcing out of Bullhorn first, or we've tried to use Bullhorn automation and, the campaign isn't as efficient, or we've added a new, you know, app to help us make phone calls but the numbers are terrible. So it's really, there's just so many layers to a database that it can be really overwhelming. People can shut down. A lot of people haven't had experience, I think, working with data at scale and realizing, there's millions and millions of different adjustments and data points. And so we just help to guide them, focus them on tangible outcomes, and to make that as clear and visual as possible so that they're confident in it. But yeah, you just got to. I mean, the bottom of the line is you just got to start. You got to start somewhere, baby steps, right, and then you can start
Yeah,
to move a little faster on fixing that database.
nice. So let's dive into maybe a couple of use cases. Before we hit record, we're talking through Ringover being a communication platform that's fully
Yep.
integrated into Bullhorn. Obviously relies on a lot of data being up to date, correct, complete for phone calls and messages and all the communications to work. I think there's a nice use case there with with what you do. So maybe let's start with that. But also, are there any other key use cases that you see as hugely valuable for staffing agencies?
Yeah, I mean, we can start with I mean, phone numbers are so critical, and that would be, not only getting good validated phone numbers, but then also, the tools to use those phone numbers to engage and connect with those recruiters. Sorry, with those candidates. But yeah, that's one of the biggest. I mean, even for time efficiency. So
Mm.
going into, into the to source out of Bullhorn, right? It's okay. You got to open up the profile. You got to find the phone numbers. Like what we even found is a lot of phone numbers aren't clickable, so they can't just like click on it, initiate a phone call. It's it's that manual work, and that means that then if they're looking in a list view, right, they can't just like, hey, I'm going to query a list and I'm just going to call all these candidates, right, and be really efficient
Mm.
with their time. So that's one use case that I think is pretty cool. Just the ease of now using those phone numbers, just being really efficient with them. The other is, like, you'll see this a lot, especially when there's been like database migrations, is they get a lot of landlines that come over or business phone numbers, or the phone number is not right in the right sort of field.
Right.
And so that's another one of,
Mm.
okay, how do you validate these phone numbers and then manage, right, where they go? Is it in the mobile slot? Do you have multiple phone numbers, right? So some people have a work phone, a work mobile phone and a personal mobile phone, and how are you tracking these? And then if they are bad, right, how are you actually tracking bad phone numbers? Because if you grab a bad phone number off of Zoom Info for a candidate, anyone else that tries to reach out to that candidate or go to Zoom Info is going to spend
Hmm.
that same time calling on that bad number, right? Or they got
Yeah.
a new cell phone. So a lot of our use cases are centered around the strategies around managing that, verifying them, focusing on mobile phones because we know that We're seeing a 97, 98%, active good phone number rate, which I think is pretty high, for industry standards. And then there's also associated phone numbers. So what's the strategy around that, right? And maybe it's a spouse or a relative, a parent that is somehow associated with that person. And
Mm,
so you can always, what's the techniques to call them? Say, hey, great, I was trying to get a hold of Jane or John, and can you help me? Give me a little more information. So that's sort of the fun part of how do you use this, associated information to drive outcomes and efficiencies.
nice. Yeah, I think, absolutely. There's a really strong use case in terms of, for a lot of agencies. And as we've spoken about, AI and automation data will help make it more efficient and productive to make those phone calls. So, and having a tier sheet where you want to run down 50 or 100 candidates, having the number populated correctly for all certainly makes a job much more easy and effective.
Yeah, and
It,
yeah, another so I was just saying another great use case too, and this is obviously phone numbers are part of it, but you have a lot of, inbound. So either you're sourcing, grabbing, candidates off of LinkedIn and you're putting them into Bullhorn, or they're inbound, right? Applying on your website or through Indeed or these other services. And so in that process, what we have is all around enrichment, and then we're working with text kernel to do all the parsing and skill management. So regardless of where that data is hitting, you're getting that consistent population of data and information. And so if you just have someone's LinkedIn URL, okay, well, what's all their contact information, right? So
right.
typically you're doing research. Hey, just put that into Bullhorn, it's going to populate immediately. Or someone applies, online. Well, how are we, writing back managed skills and filling in all the data and information, adding their LinkedIn URL or other social data information. And so that's really neat to see is, how we attribute that this would have been a lot of effort and work, or we've had situations where people have like tried to find contact information for a target candidate. They go through our enrichment process, immediately get a hold of the person, and then they can place them. So that's sort of, sometimes there's a lot going on to say, hey, how do we really tie it all to placements? But there's clear, evidence on, 5 to 10% of those placements that are literally just coming out of us adding enriched contact information that they could not find elsewhere. And then, using that among all the other, time savings and fun stuff of just structuring data. But there's contact information is always going to be critical.
So let's dive a bit more deeply into that then. Very curious every time I talk with another, recruitment service provider, ROI, success stories, how would you paint the picture, whether you've got a real example or what typically is, that success story from, before vetted AI and candidate IQ and life with what your tools.
Yeah. And that's, we have a managed process, right? So we are working with them on how do you define ROI, because the ROI will change at different stages, right? So everyone's trying to get to this
Okay.
sort of fully automated AI, autonomous agent supporting my recruiters, and my recruiters step in at certain points. So, but others are like they've never touched their database and they need to actually source out of it. So we sort of work with them on this journey, and sometimes it's on a quarterly basis or annual basis, trying to hit these goals and then help them move to those next more advanced goals. So it really starts with like, what's the state of the database, right? How much data is actually usable? How do we grade that information? Understanding how much of it's missing. So, in that journey, we really go from just updating, refreshing the database, reparsing all the records and resumes that are in there, making sure that it's up to date as possibly can be. It's reliable and usable. So if recruiters are going to go in, right, they can actually not sift through a bunch of junk, right, when they're doing their
Mm,
searches. So it also means that, hey, we're helping to identify records that we're going to archive. And then it's, the ROI comes in. Again, they start, they trust the database. So now they're starting to source and search in it. And then they're making phone calls and they're making placements because we've updated the skills, we've updated where they work, we've added, new phone numbers and emails. And so that's a really cool, outcome and ROI.
sure.
And then on campaigns, we'll see, people will just have a bunch of records in there with no emails. And so we'll go in and we'll update you know, 95, 96% of those, add all the emails, and they're seeing, only like a 2% bounce back rate from those campaigns and the emails we added. So it's really, are you trying to get better performance in your automations?
Mm.
Are you trying to encourage recruiters to go dive into the database, right, and make phone calls and search? We also work with a lot of healthcare companies buy lists. So they buy lists, and then how do you actually make sure that you know who to call, or who's going to be, you can engage with them. So we do a
Right.
lot of just sort of that management, or fixing, a lot of imports that came into the system that sort of created these, like, data debt or blind, data problems that they're unaware of, that we can uncover.
And any specific examples come to mind where you go in there and you're aiming for 96% and they're at a much lower rate? Can you paint us a picture with numbers there in terms of when you first open the door to their database?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's all going to depend on how the firm has been organizing that data, or, you know, um, just managing their data. So a lot of firms, like, don't even have resumes at all. So, okay, what do you do there? Especially when you're talking about enrichment, a lot of it's going to focus on how much unique information do we have to be able to match to this external profile, right? To update it. And you have people who get married and change names, right? They change locations. You have foreigners who go by American nicknames. So there's sort of this, and this is what we spend a lot of time on, is how do we trust that information, and and how do we update it? So there, and it will vary between industries as well. So obviously professional, a lot of people are on LinkedIn. That's sort of a unique identifier. It's easier, or more consistent, or they add it into the system. So yeah, I'd say professional, we're going to have, you know, 85 to 95% sort of success rate on the enrichment side of things. Light industrial, it's going to be lower than
Mm.
that. And then healthcare, that'll range as well from, 75 to 85%. Light industrial can be as low as, 60, 65%. And because we're, volume based, we work with that. We know, like, before anyone works with us, they know exactly what the expected enrichment rate is.
Right.
And part of this is, that's secondary data. So we also focus on primary data, which is like your applications, or the data that's being put into Bullhorn, and then what's in the resume, and how we, analyze and, better structure that information, and put the data in the right spot for your team. So it's really consistent. So that sort of managed parsing element, and even the skill management, right, and the formatting and all of that, like, we always start with that. Like, that should be your first consistent, data quality strategy. And then it's, okay, how do we supplement, augment, and update using secondary information? And then, right, based on time, or how old the record is, right, how we do all the ongoing active data quality management, and, and our sort of strategies aligned with your different business outcomes.
Yeah. Interesting. How are you thinking about, you know, the year ahead, the 2 years ahead? It feels like a lot of AI and LLMs, they're really at the start. They're probably, you know, the worst they're ever gonna be. They're only gonna improve. Where do you see things going in the industry?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but I think there's going to be a high demand for branching off of these models and fine tuning it. I mean, there's ones that don't, are pretty easy, generic, like, hey, just send a marketing message. I think the screening and qualifications, right, and the follow ups, if somebody starts to develop, IP around that, or they believe they have a unique process, or they need to have some sort of guarantees on outcomes, I just think that they're going to want to personalize, those models, right, or even somewhat maybe have ownership on it, right? If they
Right.
create a new service, say, hey, there's something around, like, this type of qualification, and it's unique to us, and how we engage, and the types of questions we ask, they might, likely want to keep that private to themselves and have a really cool model. So I think that is going to be, how you manage that. Also, the interesting piece to this is, and and if everyone doesn't know, there's a sort of a memory issue with these models. Like if you ask ChatGPT to do like something 1,000 times over, right? It just sort of breaks or it forgets what it was doing. We're like, hey, reference something months ago that I did. So, this is where it's going to be. How do you manage the models? How do you manage the versions? Right. Every time they come out with these new model versions, like, well, no, I like that last one. And did you just sunset it? Like I had that dialed in. I had all my prompts. It gave me my output, but now you just said that's no longer available. Go to 4 or 3.0 or these, Grok 3. It's like, no, I had the other one rolling. Like, why did you change it? So you
I've
change.
been
Yeah.
there.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah,
You've
I've
been there.
been
Yeah.
there.
What
Yeah,
was
yeah,
it's frustrating. Like you built
yeah.
trust, right? You're relying on it. It's giving you
Hmm.
what you want. You made a change. Like that's kind of weird, right? Or there's like the behavior of it changes, and now you got to tweak it. So I think that will be the model management, and then really where it's all going is in an organization. You're going to have because the models lack common sense when you're looking at sort of a business or tying a bunch of services together. Things that we pick up on are like, oh, that's kind of odd.
Mm.
Like, why is it doing that? Or it doesn't make sense. When it's odd like that, you'll train a new model, right, to solve that sort of oddity. So eventually, it's somehow they're going to figure this out, right, within, Bullhorn, Salesforce, all these different platforms. But it's okay, you have all these different models that are working together, working independently, and then you have that model on top that sort of sees the outputs of all the different models. And so it'll be, who knows how long it'll take, but be able to fine tune and deploy a model to do specific tasks, and then layer, right, sort of management tasks on top of that, right, and being able to
Right.
fine tune those until they get to like AGI, and it doesn't matter, and it's so smart. Who cares? But I think
Yeah.
that's going to be a ways off.
I'm really curious to see, particularly in the recruiting staffing space, where it feels like there's already a triangulation between AI can help you create the job description, the candidate uses AI to create the CV, and then you have the AI, trying to you know figure out which is the best candidate, and yet it's all potentially written and assessed by the same model. So it's almost like how's that kind of unwind
Yeah.
itself? And
The
so whether there's AI then that is clever enough to identify CVs that are purely AI driven, and maybe there's a different scoring, or I don't know. Feels like the Wild West in many regards.
Yeah, this is the problem with the absolute scoring system and matching. And this is, now like you just mentioned, it's easier and easier. Like just create a resume, and it's probably the same model creating the job description and the resume. So that's what it knows is good.
Yeah.
And so everyone's just going to say, hey, AI create this for me. The AI is going to do the matching and say, hey, this person's a perfect match or a great fit. So
Yeah.
one is the follow up. All right. So now you got to automate the follow up. And then what we've always stressed on is natural language. So how do you get somebody, and you could do this through, a transcript or even questions, but get them to write about the stories of their life where they can't really game it, right? So how did you
Mm.
use Java? How did you help support, this rural community as a nurse? Like the stories that the person can tell, and then understanding how the stories and the concepts actually relate back to the job function. Right. That's sort of that next level. And so everyone's smart. Like they're going to figure out, hey, the absolute matching ranking, like there's going to need to be more data and information, and do it in a way that people can't just game the system. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, maybe everyone just does a podcast before they submit a resume, and then you can analyze all their answers
Right.
and everything. And
Yeah.
people have tried to do that, but
Well, yeah, look, we've already got, video interviewing tools and other ways that people can, or, go through a process where there is some, a real person needs to speak, and yeah, that can be, as you say, summarized and analyzed.
and that's just on that aspect too. I know higher view, there are some issues
Okay.
too around like, are they confident? Are they not? Right. And the issues where people like, I just got in a car accident before my video
Right.
interview, so I was a little bit off. So this is also just want to emphasize like the techniques and like where we deploy it. So okay, what are they really talking about? What are the concepts? How are they expressing, right, ideas and knowledge versus I think sometimes, right, there's those other biases that can creep in where they're just trying to hard screen somebody, but maybe how they were screening and there's bias baked in, and those are things we just need to be aware of.
Yeah, and as tools become, prevalent right through the whole, hiring journey, you could imagine a place where the job is advertised and then placed. In between, you're kind of blind to actually what signals or what biases, positive or negative, took place through that process. And then if I'm a recruiter or an agency owner, am I confident I'm getting the right results out of that? So I guess there must be some ways now or in the future where that kind of audit and sense checking can also be possible.
Yeah, and this is a great, everyone says, "Hey, AI is gonna replace recruiters or other people within the organization," but now it's, "Hey, no, now you need people to understand the decisions that are being made. How do you manage? How do you fine tune?" So that's sort of the exciting sort of journey. And I started as a recruiter, right? And that was, hey, I had ideas for algorithms and way to improve my, um, my performance and getting good phone numbers. That was one of the first things. So that was right, the enrichment side
Yeah.
of it. But I think that's that journey for those really curious recruiters who are now using ChatGPT and thinking about, okay, how do we optimize and manage these services and systems to, maximize output for the rest of the team, and then focus on those human touches and those human engagements that I think are always going to be needed and embraced to help people feel good about taking their next career or their next job.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, yeah, as we look to wrap this up, just wanted to close with a few kind of questions to make sure we've got the best out of you and your experience and knowledge. If I'm an agency leader or owner listening to this, I guess how would you sum up the takeaways of how they should be thinking about AI and data, and then what they should be considering to do to improve their position in the market?
Yeah, I think the first thing would be just you know appoint somebody to focus on it, and then start to think about how are we going to measure impact in the business, right? So I think that's sometimes it's by committee. And so everyone's like, "Hey, we know we need to do something." Well, okay, what are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? How are we going to measure success with that? I also had a great conversation the other day with the CIO of the staffing agency, and he was talking about also, you know, sort of there's hesitancy and then demand to see immediate results, but also then if you as you're implementing these technologies, what's the like the backfill and the recruiter time? So the change management of, hey, we're putting
Mm,
in something that's going to automate outreach, right, and get us schedule meetings for you. If that frees up an hour or two of your time, what are you going to be focused on during that? And making sure
right.
that that's all going to be driving, towards growth in the business or efficiency gains. So I think it's really, appoint somebody, start coming up with a plan. We're happy to help. Is part of our process to do that, and then how you want to measure success, and just start somewhere, start any sort of process to get
Mm.
familiar and comfortable with it, and don't be afraid to embrace it. And if something goes wrong, just move on, right? It's it shouldn't be embarrassing or anything like that. Just we tried automations, it didn't work. Great. How do we correct it? Or we tried to use this chatbot to do, to engage and it wasn't quite right. Like just it's going to happen. You just got to fine tune and work through it and think about it a little bit more like being an entrepreneur and iterating through your AI data strategy and how it's going to help you grow long term.
I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this who are thinking, yeah, have a plan. Absolutely. I think as these things start to evolve, it is very much just test and try and get familiar, which is great. That's part of the learning process. But then once you kind of a view of, I think we've got an idea of how we can use this technology. I think it also gives, you mentioned, automating a process that frees up 2 hours of a recruiter's time. If I'm a recruiter, I think, well, if you do that 4 more times, I'm out of a job. But if you have a
Yep.
plan and a backfill, it's going to give me confidence to say, hey, I can make more money. I'm in for this. I'm going to lean forward, not be, leaning back and fear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Make them a part of the process. Don't just make them feel scared of the process. And that was early on. What we had too was even with really good algorithms that could help replace decision making, they do say it's bad, right? So they'd be
Right.
like, "Oh, no, I don't really like it," because they're afraid of losing their job. So then you're not getting accurate input from the team on how valuable it really is, and that's, admissions, application screening, all of that. It's just they wanna hold on to a process they've developed, and they might be giving you bad feedback because you haven't properly given them, "This is your next step with us implementing this," right? "This is how we're gonna help
Right.
you grow as a recruiter," right, or as a marketer.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really critical piece that needs to come with it.
Nice. And yeah, as a business founder, leader, um, over the last 10 years, there'll be a lot of staffing founders and leaders listening to this podcast. Are there any kind of general business running that you found in terms of some advice you've had before, or maybe a podcast or a book that you really could think about in terms of the way that you just run your business that you could share with the audience?
Yeah, I think, riches are in the niches, or niches, but it doesn't sound as good that way. So as Alex Hormozy,
Yeah.
that was pretty influential because you can do too much. So we came out, especially early on, right? We're raising money, like, we can do all these cool things with AI models and agents, and we just spread ourselves really, too thin, in terms of the different applications, which is part of why we said, hey, if we can, let's focus on, like, we sort of went way too broad with our AI. So we said, hey, where can we focus on a market that really
Mm,
needs help and it's very repeatable? So every time we, have success, that it can build on that, right? Make it better for our customers, make it easier for us. So that's why we picked Bullhorn, right? This was intentional, in staffing firms working with their inventory of candidates. So that would be my thing, is make sure you're focused, and it can be very easy to start adding all these features, right? And just keep competing with feature additions. And that's,
yeah,
that can be hard. So, but yeah, just riches are in the niches. I thought that was great. Think about it, but it can't be too niche, right? So you have to have enough market to,
yeah,
make sure that it's, people can talk about what you're doing and share success stories.
indeed. Yeah. Well, I think Alex Hormozy's, his books are like, isn't it, $100 million pipeline or
What?
$100
Yep.
million lead. So I think he's talking big, still doing the
Yep.
niche or the niche, but still, getting great outcomes is the model. Um, Great. Andrew, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or any closing thoughts or comments?
Yeah. I think, we're just seeing, sort of data coming into the forefront. Whether, people like it or not, you're a data company, you're an AI company, right? This is part of the workforce. You can think about, if you're not aggressive in your data, right, and you see the value, think about it as health insurance for your AI models and your automations. That this is like, it's part of your team, right? So it's the fuel, it's the foundation. But it is something that those strategies are going to come, hand in hand, and it's going to make your life easier to adopt AI, and also just embrace it. Just this is a fun journey. You have AI everywhere. Just understand what works for you, what you're comfortable using, and just I think that culture of innovation is critical.
Amazing. We are going to wrap up. Thank you so much, Andrew. For listeners, I can see you're very active on LinkedIn, recently posting your 50 millionth data point added to Bullhorn.
Yep.
So a lot of great content on there. Obviously, we can go to vetted.ai. And anywhere else people want to reach out to you or find you?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn, or email me, andrew@vetted.ai, and it's VETTD.ai. So it's missing a vowel, and it was very expensive when I founded the company, so I went for it without the vowel. I regret that. But anyway, so VETTD.ai, or you can reach out to your Bullhorn rep or find us on the Bullhorn Marketplace.
Amazing. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for listening. See you on the next episode.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate you having me.